First Things, episode number 13.
I seem to be lost.
And so you're working around the clock so you don't take time for yourself to feel like an actual human being.
I used to feel like no matter how hard I worked, I was just spinning my wheels.
Try to be perfect and try to have everything in place at one point in time, and you can't.
Well, hello, everyone. This is First Things, the podcast dedicated to practical productivity based on modern research. My name is Brandon Vaughn, and it's my goal to help you apply productive solutions to your life to help you live with less stress, greater passion, and amazing results. Today, we are talking about how ice cream is causing increased divorce rates. And you say, okay, what? What is all that about? Well, you could do studies on this and actually show that there is a relationship between the number of ice cream sales and increased divorce rates. I could also go into any school in your district and show that the kids' shoe size is directly related to their intelligence and their IQ scores. So a bigger a kid's shoe size is, then the more intelligent they are. And if you're saying, okay, what does all of that mean? Well, we're talking today about how statistical studies and findings can mislead you or make you think things that may not be causal in nature, the cause or the actual influencer of that particular outcome. So things like ice cream sales and divorce rates. So if you're dealing with larger cities, for example, you're going to have more people. More people means more ice cream sales, and it also means more divorce rates. That is the cause of this thing, but you often hear it reported in the news media, something extravagant like this, and I'm going to point to some examples of that today. Same thing with the kid's shoe size and IQ. Well, guess what's causing that relationship? It's their age. The older a kid is, the higher their IQ will be, and the bigger their shoe size is going to be. It's not that the shoe size is causing their IQ to go up. And this is very important to me. I really struggle so much with this. You know that this podcast is focused around research. I believe that's such an important thing. And I will hear people quote research all the time in news articles. I also hear them report that in podcast episodes. And some of those very statistical studies could be killing your productivity. And I'm going to talk about why that is, because we can base our life upon some statistical study as if that is what it's all about. I have seen countless studies like the ice cream and divorce one that we're going to talk about today. And I think a lot of these really could be killing your productivity. You could be basing too much off of a study. Let me give you one example before we actually get started today. I heard a podcast not too long ago. It's one of my favorite podcasts, in which the person was talking about being a morning person. And they quoted a study, or they mentioned that there was research showing that being a morning person meant that you were more productive. So some people can become so obsessed now with getting up early so that they feel like that alone is going to cause more productivity, like it's the magic pill. I'm not productive, so I know the reason. I need to be a morning person, and becoming a morning person is going to make all of the difference in the world, and that's going to make me productive. And they get disappointed to find that it wasn't this magic pill that they thought it was. Or they do the morning thing and they find they're more productive and they think, it's because I'm a morning person, that's what's doing it. They may find success in it and assume that that's what was the cause of it, and it really wasn't. There was other things about that. So I want to explain some of the common mistakes people make with statistical studies today and how you can be a more discerning consumer of such studies. Now, before we get started, I want to mention a few things, and I wanted to encourage you to leave me questions, and I will answer them here. You can email me, you can put this on my blog site, but you can also leave me a voicemail, and unless you tell me otherwise, I will even play your voice here. If you have a website, I will mention your website and promote it, but I will mention any questions you have. So if you do have some questions about productivity, please ask me. I'm happy to talk about it. And I'm particularly happy to talk about any of the psychological aspects of productivity, all the stuff we've been talking about in regard to stinking thinking and being more assertive and getting unstuck in our emotions, all of these types of things. I'm happy to talk about specific things or just issues of how you apply that in your own life. So feel free to leave me some voicemail and we'll talk about that here. Also, for my Facebook followers, I noticed this the other day that if you like my page, it doesn't always mean that you get my notifications. But sometimes I may post something that I think you would really enjoy, or I post an update to my particular podcast. And if you hover your mouse over the like button on my page, there will be a menu that pops up. And one of those options that you can click is Get Notifications. And if you will click that, so not only should you maybe like my page, but if you really want to hear from me on Facebook, hover your mouse over the like button and click the Get Notifications. The way that Facebook operates now is that it will show you things that it thinks you want to see. So if you like a page, it doesn't mean that you will always see everything that I post. It's going to try to decide, well, okay, you like my post, once, and therefore you don't want to see me very often. Or you liked me 5 times post that I made, and therefore it will show up more. But if you want to just see things that I'm posting on a regular basis and not let Facebook decide what you should or should not see, then that's something you can do. You can like my page and then hover over that like button and choose the Get Notifications, and then you'll hear from me a lot more regularly. And I hope you will consider doing that, especially if you like this show. Okay, so now to the topic of today. You know what they say? They say that 75% of all statistics are just made up. And I often have to wonder that. There's a lot of really crazy studies out there. And also 65% of the time, I'm right 100% of the time. So a student asked a math professor, an engineer, and a statistician what 1/3 was in decimal format. And the professor says, oh, that's 0.33. The engineer says, oh, that's 0.333333333. The statistician responds, well, what do you want it to be? And I consider myself a statistician, so I feel like I can poke fun at these types of things. The fact is that you can make anything mean anything with statistics, and I don't know what it is about statistics, but the minute you start quoting statistics to people, it's like they turn their brains off and they just accept whatever it is that comes along. And I see this all the time in the business world. Business world just worships at the altar of statistics. And I believe in statistics. I think it's such a tremendous benefit to knowing things and discovering things, but people don't question things when it comes to statistics, and that's what we want to do today. Now, let me give you some examples. These are actually pulled from different examples that are freely available on the internet. Some of the crazy assumptions or even the results that can sometimes come from statistical results. Here's one. People with a low sense of self-worth are more likely to suffer from memory loss as they get older. Feeding children a diet rich in fish could prevent violent and antisocial behavior in their teens, according to research to be announced this week, which suggests the root causes of crime may be biological rather than social. This is I'm not making this up. Actual quote I got from a research or quoting of research. Feeding kids fish will make them not be criminals in life. So everyone feed your kids fish and they'll all be law-abiding citizens is basically what that's saying. Intelligent children may be more likely to be vegetarian as adults, suggests a study published online by the British Medical Journal. So intelligent children are going to be vegetarians, and so if your child ends up not being a vegetarian, must mean that they're not intelligent. Obese girls are half as likely to attend college as non-obese girls, according to a new study from the University of Texas at Austin. So here it's saying, okay, if a girl is obese, they're most likely not going to go to college. So these types of studies will come along then, and people will either hear this or somebody who's in the media will quote this and saying, okay, we need to put people on diets because if they're thinner, then they'll go to college, and this is kind of a causal type effect. Here's another one. The results of 2 new studies suggest that the neighborhood you live in affects your chances of developing schizophrenia. Surprisingly, neighborhood seems to have no effect on your risk of bipolar disorder. So if you're schizophrenia, it's because of where you live. Winning soccer's World Cup not only lifts a nation's spirit, it lowers the death rate from heart attacks, doctors said on Tuesday. So, if somebody loses the World Cup, that means a lot of people are going to be dying from heart attacks. Here's a cool one for all my Facebook listeners and followers. Facebook users have lower overall grades than non-users, according to a survey of college students who also ironically said that the social networking site does not interfere with studying. How about this? Children who eat too much candy may be more likely to be arrested for violent behavior as adults, new research suggests. Kids who eat candy, more likely to be arrested. Dogs being walked by men are 4 times more likely to threaten and bite other dogs, and dogs on a leash are more likely to act aggressively than dogs off the leash. Now, this is why you will hear one month about how coffee is bad for you, and then the next month how good it is for you. And it's just madness because it's like flavor of the month. Is coffee good for you? Is it bad for you? Children who eat candy more likely to be arrested. Facebook users have lower grades. People who win the World Cup may actually lower death rates in their particular area. It's just madness. I want to play for you a talk by Ionica Smeets, where she talks about the danger of mixing up causality and correlation. And this is something that we're going to talk about more in this particular episode.
Welcome. I came here today to warn you about the dangers of ice cream. You may not be aware of this, but these innocent-looking cones full of sweetness are one of the major causes of drownings. And I've got the numbers to prove it. So if you plot a graph of the number of ice creams that are sold, and you compare it with the number of drownings, you can see there is clearly an upwards trend. And I think it's very safe to conclude from this that we should ban ice cream because it's very dangerous. Since you are all smart people, you've probably figured out there's something wrong with my example. What's really happening here is, of course, that there is an underlying factor, which is nice weather, you might have guessed it. And if the weather is nice, more people will go out swimming and unfortunately drown, and at the same time, more people will buy ice cream. And it's not the ice cream that's causing the drownings. And here it's really easy to see that there is something wrong, but jumping to an incorrect conclusion about causality when you see a correlation is the most often made logical mistake. And today my goal is to make sure that in the future you can recognize this mistake, and I really hope you can avoid making it in the future for yourselves. And I'll do this by just giving some famous examples. And the first one is really rather innocent. The fact is that married men live longer than single men. If you look at the statistics, you see that this is really happening. And women's magazines, they like to conclude from this that marriage is very healthy for men because it makes them live longer. Well, a friend of mine, he likes to joke that marriage mainly makes life seem longer, but that's because his wife is... But so, can anyone guess what's going on here? Because there is a causal relation, but it's the other way around. The fact is that men who are healthy and rich and well educated and have a much higher life expectancy, these are the men that are much more likely to find a wife. That's the way women are. And the guys who have a very low life expectancy, so they're unhealthy and poor, they are not as likely to get married. So it's the high life expectancy that is causing the marriage, not the other way around. Well, and this, of course, it's not so serious. No one will get married just because he read this. So let's move on to a more serious example. It was also more serious research. In Nature was a study in 1999 that showed that young kids who sleep with the lights on, that they have a much higher probability of becoming short-sighted later in life. Well, and the researchers, they were smart and they wrote very careful that they had found the correlation and they didn't know how the causal relation might work, but just to be sure they advised all parents to turn off the lights at night. And in the popular media, this became that bed lamps were night abuse, children's abuse, and that it was very bad if parents used lamps in the bedroom. And many parents were worried. I can imagine if this would have happened when my son was sleeping with the lights on, I would have felt really bad. But luckily, the article had to be corrected the next week. And maybe some of you can guess, if there are biologists in the audience, they know. Short-sightedness is genetic. And so it's parents who are short-sighted, and those are the parents who like to leave the light on in the bedroom. And they also are the parents who have short-sighted kids. So again, a simple mistake, easy to make. Then what is, I think, the worst example I know many of them. I see at least one of these in the newspapers every week. But this is a classic one. In the 70s, researchers found that there's a very strong link between kids who do well in school, get good grades, and kids who have a high self-esteem. And they concluded from this that it's very important to make sure that young kids are, raised to be confident and proud of themselves, because if their self-esteem is high, the good results will follow. And this was what was told to parents, especially in the US, for generations, that just make sure that your kid is proud and confident, then all will turn out well. And many years later, someone did another study just to see in which direction the cause was working, and they found that it was in the opposite direction. So the good grades were causing the self-esteem, and self-esteem wasn't causing good grades, and it was even worse. So kids who are raised just to have high self-confidence and not excel at anything, it can be sports or music, doesn't have to be school, but kids who are just proud of themselves and then fail at everything, in the end they will have a very low self-esteem and not be able to make anything of their life. So this was a very serious correlation mistake. And what I want for today is for you to remember that the next time someone wants to prove that there is a causal relation between something and something else, it can be anything. It can be vaccines and autism. It can be female bankers and the financial crisis. And if they point out to you that there is a very strong relation, remember that it's not enough to have a correlation. It gives a very good hint of what might be happening, but before you can conclude that one thing causes something else, you need to know why it does and how it does. So when in doubt, just remember the ice cream. Thank you very much.
So let's talk about a few terms here because I think it's helpful. There's mention about causality. There's mention about correlation. So what do we mean by that? Well, let's first talk about correlation. When we say correlation, we're just saying that two things are related in some way. A lot of times we're thinking it's a very simple thing, that it's not a very complex. And most studies are looking at simple types of relationships, that if one thing goes up, the other goes up. And if one thing goes down, then the other thing goes down. There's that tendency that they kind of relate to one another in such a way that we can predict patterns and trends in that. And that's what we basically say is correlation. So ice cream sales and death rates, or ice cream sales and divorce rates. More ice cream sales goes up, the more the divorce rates go up. So there's that tendency there, there's that pattern, and we say that those are correlated in that fashion. Now, what do we mean by causality? Well, causality basically means cause and effect. We're saying that this is the reason why it's happening. This is the catalyst behind what is going on. So if we say that ice cream sales and divorce rates have a causal relationship, we're basically saying that one of those is causing the other to happen. So it's the ice cream sales that's causing the divorce rates. And this is the trouble that you can get into with correlational type of studies, is assuming that you're showing a cause and effect relationship. And that is typically not what you're proving in that type of study. And by the way, the majority of studies that you typically hear in the news media and in podcasts and different things like that are correlational studies. That is the majority of ones that are being done today. And the reason why these correlational studies aren't definitive to prove a cause and effect relationship is because they are mostly observational studies versus an experiment. Now, I'm sure you may have remembered what an experiment is, maybe back in school, but in an experiment, you are directly trying to manipulate an outcome, usually through a treatment, and the treatment is what you're actually testing to see the influence of the outcome. Typically, you will have two groups. You will have a control group that doesn't get the treatment, and then you will have an experimental group which will get the treatment. Ideally, you want those two groups randomly selected, and the reason for that is you are reducing any kind of bias or any other types of things that may influence the results. And if the experimental group seems to take to the treatment, then it must be the treatment that caused the difference between the two groups. And that is the power of an experiment if done properly. Most studies, though, nowadays are more observational in nature. And that means that we are not trying to manipulate an outcome. We're just simply observing people in their natural state. We're asking them questions, we're surveying them, we're asking how they feel. We're just watching what they do. We're not actually trying to change them. We're not introducing any kind of random assignment into this. back in the 60s and 70s, experiments were much more the norm. Probably 70% of all research done was experiments. But today, and that's why I say sadly, probably 80% of all research is observational in nature. And there's a multitude of reasons for that. One of them is that observational studies are quicker to do. And in universities, and I can speak from experience in this, the name of that game is that you get published and get published a lot and very frequently. So the quantity is what really matters. And they'll say that the quality is what matters, but it doesn't. I'm being honest with you. They say that, but it's the quantity that really matters, especially for people that are trying to get tenure at a university. And therefore, they need to get things out quick. And an observational study you could do in just a matter of a month or so and write it up and get it out to possibly be published. Whereas in an experiment, it takes a lot of time and effort, and it could take a long time before you actually get something like that published. It may take 6 months or even a year. And so most people are just doing observational studies today. And also there are a lot more restrictions about doing experiments on students, and you have to get all this approval through committees, and observational studies where you just survey people are a piece of cake to get permission for. And it's just kind of the way it's going. And sadly, you just see less and less of experiments being done. So because observational studies do not attempt to control for external influences on the study's results, we have to be very careful of how we apply the results. And a very common phrase that you will hear in an introductory statistics course is that correlation does not prove causality. And the reason why, again, is because correlational studies typically are observational studies. We're just observing people, asking them questions, and because we are not randomly splitting them up and controlling for external influences and testing the direct effect of a treatment, we cannot say that anything that's related in a correlation or in an observational study actually implies a cause and effect relationship. So let's go back to one of the examples we talked about earlier. Children who eat too much candy may be more likely to be arrested for violent behavior as adults. This is a classical observational study. We aren't causing the children to eat a certain thing or not. We're not causing them to be arrested, hopefully. We're just observing them. And so what are we doing? We're probably observing them as adults, and we're asking them, okay, you were arrested for violent behavior. Now tell me about your eating habits as a child. Oh, you ate a lot of candy. Okay. Oh, here's somebody. They weren't arrested for violent behavior. Tell me about your diet when you were growing up. We're just simply observing people. We're simply watching them. We're simply asking them questions. And there are problems with that if we turn around and say, okay, it's the candy that's causing them to be eventually arrested for violent behavior. Okay, there is a link there. Maybe there is truly a correlation. Children who do eat too much candy typically are arrested later for violent behavior. That may be true, but it's not saying that the candy is causing the arrest for violent behavior later. There may be a lot of other things. For example, could it be that maybe the kids who are eating too much candy don't have a lot of parental guidance? And if they don't have a lot of parental guidance, then that could in turn affect that they are arrested later for violent behavior. So maybe parental interaction that's causing this relationship to exist in the first place. So we've got to be really, really careful when we hear these types of studies to not jump to conclusions. Let's go back to the other example that I talked about earlier, the one that I heard on a podcast many months ago, that people who get up early in the morning typically are more productive people. Again, this is an observational study. We are not making people become morning people. We don't have a group, let's say, of night people, and we randomly split them up into two groups. One group we say, okay, you are now going to become morning people, and this other group, no, you're not going to become morning people. And we enforce that this group that are morning people, night people turned into morning people, really do stick with it. So we are enforcing this. Then maybe a month or two later, we diagnose their productivity scientifically. We just don't ask them, but we measure it somehow, maybe how long it takes them to do a certain task. Then we may conclude that morning is causing that more productivity for that person. But that's probably not what happened. In fact, I know it isn't because I looked up that particular study. All they did was they were asking people, what's your preference? Are you a morning person or a night person? Okay, you're a morning person, so tell me what your perception is on productivity. So you aren't controlling that, and you're also asking them to rate their own productivity on some type of scale. So it's more of their opinion about how productive they are. So I think two things are happening there. First of all, the morning people believe that morning makes them more productive. So they're rating themselves as more productive than the night people. The night people sometimes feel like my day has just been hectic and sometimes I have to push things off and have to finish it up late at night. So I didn't really feel like I was that productive because I had to stay up late doing it. Whereas the morning people feel like because they're morning people, they are more productive. So if you ask them to rate their productivity, the morning people are going to more naturally rate themselves as being productive just because of the perception they have about themselves. Also, we're not saying that the morning is causing the more productivity. Could just be simply that morning people have less distractions. So what's really causing the productivity is less distractions, and morning people have less of those than maybe night people do. Could also have something to do with how tired they are. Maybe a morning person isn't as tired and therefore they're more focused, whereas night people maybe are more tired and they have a harder time focusing after a long period of day. It isn't the time of day, it just may be how tired they are or how many distractions they have, or could just be a fact that morning people are rating themselves as more productive in the first place. And it has nothing to do with being a morning person, it just has with their perception of what it is. So again, we have to be very, very careful about reading some study like this and assuming that we know what it means or implying that it is a cause-effect type of relationship. There are always variables that are hidden behind the scenes of observational studies, of correlational studies, variables that are actually maybe causing that relationship or are influencing the results. You could have two events, that event A causes event B, maybe event B causes event A, could be that there's some other event C that's causing A and B to happen. So again, in the case of a morning person, perhaps it's the lack of distractions that's actually causing that relationship. So someone who loves working at night can be just as productive because it isn't really the morning part. It's about the distraction part. Another thing you have to really watch out for are samples and how they actually select the people. Bad samples can produce bias in the results. There's a famous case of this. The advice columnist Ann Landers once asked her readers, if you had to do it over again, would you have children? And a few weeks later, they blasted this in the headlines, which says these were the results. 70% of parents say that kids are not worth it, which was a shocking result. That means that for my listeners, almost 3/4 of all my listeners, your parents wish you had never been born. And that's a crazy result because it just doesn't sound right. And in fact, later on, I mean, these were thousands and thousands of parents. I think nearly 10,000 people who wrote into this thing. And it was a major, major thing. A few months later, after this, there was a proper statistical study done, and they found that almost 90% said that kids were worth it. Now, isn't that crazy? One result says 70% say that kids are not worth it. Another study says that 90% say kids are worth it. That's the exact opposite. And you hear this all of the time in research that totally contradicts each other. I mean, have we ever heard of coffee is good for you one month, coffee is bad for you next month? What is going on here? A lot of times it's bad sampling techniques. In the case of Ann Landers, what was happening is she invited her readers to respond. Send me a letter if you agree with this or tell me your opinions on this. Well, who are going to be the people who take the time to respond to those types of situations? It's usually going to be the people that are extremely negative or extreme in any direction, usually extremely negative. The people that are neutral with their kids or love their kids aren't always going to write into those things. Not to mention, not everyone reads Ann Landers' column, so you're getting a very biased result. You're getting people in that particular era that read newspapers and happened to read that advice columnist, and that wasn't a fair representative sample of how everyone believed, whereas the other study was a more statistically designed sample, more random in nature, and therefore was probably more reflective of what people felt. The other thing you have to watch out for is what are they actually asking? For instance, I saw a study one time which asked this question: don't you agree that social workers should earn more money than they currently earn? But when they presented the results, they said that 95% of the responders felt like social workers should earn more money. But that isn't what they asked them. The question was biased already. Don't you agree that social workers should earn more money? And it was pushed in a way that makes people say, well, yeah, sure. It's biased in more of a positive type of outcome or a positive type of response. Many times you'll see this on news media where they will ask a question, and when they report the results, they never really say what the original question was. They will change it up, and they will do this type of question bias. Also, there is a response bias, and that is the fact that when people reply, they don't always tell the truth, or they exaggerate it, or they get mistaken. So if you ask an elderly person how often they took their medicine, they may say 5 times when it was actually 3, and they just kind of forgot. I recently listened to a podcast about a study on teenagers in gangs, and along with all this data, the individual responses were quoted and discussed. And it was interesting that neither the author of the study nor the interviewer mentioned the possibility that these teenage boys were just exaggerating their answers to make themselves sound tougher. There was a response bias going on, and there was a perception that these guys wanted to make in their responses in this particular study. It's a well-established fact that people tend to stretch the truth to make themselves look good, and that either through selective information or even distortion of memories, we actually tend to remember events and patterns in a light that flatters our self-image and agrees with our preconceptions. So for any given survey response, there seems to be at least 4 possibilities that you must keep in mind. So any study that has a survey, keep these 4 things in mind. First of all, the response may be full, accurate description of the situation. Or secondly, the respondent believes the response to be true, but their memory is either biased or incomplete. Number 3, the respondent believes the response to be mostly true, but with some deliberately altered details to make themselves look better. Or number 4, the response is mostly or entirely a deliberate lie. So you ask your employees, how do you feel about your boss? Many times people will tone it down. They're afraid to tell the truth. You ask them about drug habits or sexual habits or anything like that, many times people won't be honest, or there have been studies done to show that males will exaggerate and that females will underplay many of those types of things because of the social repercussions that might have if people ever found out exactly what they said on those particular surveys. So you have to keep that in mind on any type of survey, is that there are going to be response biases and people don't always tell the truth. And that may even sound malicious, and sometimes they just are deceived. Sometimes they think it's true, and it's not really true, and we always have to keep that in mind. You know, I once asked my students to do a study where they went out and asked people questions, and I wanted to demonstrate these types of things. And I had them make up a thing about rebel efforts in Alpha Centauri. And I don't know where I got that from. I think Alpha Centauri was something off of Star Trek or something. So I had them go ask people, do you agree with the rebel efforts in Alpha Centauri? And it was crazy how you got responses. People said yes. People said, no, I'm against it. And it was totally made up. There was no fact, no truth about this. And yet we came back with something like 73% of people said they agreed with this. So you've got to be careful about this because people sometimes answer questions and they answer it sincerely, but they don't know what they're talking about. Or sometimes they just deliberately try to manipulate the results of something. Okay, so let's move into some action steps. And I thought, okay, how can I do action steps for something like this? But let's look at an actual study and see if we can pick apart what I'm talking about here so you can be a better consumer of statistical information. The first thing you should do anytime you look at a study, you hear a study, is ask yourself whether or not this seems like an observational study or an experiment. Because if it's an observational study, if they're doing surveys, if they're observing people, if they're asking people questions, you need to be very careful about making causal conclusions from that, of assuming this is a cause-effect relationship. So I'm going to post a link to this website up so you can look at it later, but let me read some of this to you. The title says, Study links 8 hours sleep to shorter lifespan. Says, contrary to popular belief, people who sleep 6 to 7 hours a night live longer, and those who sleep 8 hours or more die younger, according to the largest study ever conducted on the subject. The controversial study, which tracked the sleeping habits of 1.1 million Americans for 6 years, undermines the advice of many sleep doctors who have long recommended that people get 8 or 9 hours of sleep every night. They go on that the study was not designed to answer whether people could extend their lifespans by sleeping less, but they said it is possible that people who sleep longer tend to suffer from sleep apnea, a condition in which impaired breathing puts stress on the heart and brain. They also speculated that the need for sleep is akin to the need for food, and that getting less than people want may be better for them. And then they quote a researcher that says, well, none of this says that sleep kills people. You should sleep as much as you need to feel awake, alert, and attentive the next day. I'm much more concerned about people shortchanging themselves on sleep than people sleeping too long. Okay, so here's this research, and I'm sitting here thinking, oh gosh, I thought that sleeping 8 hours or 9 hours was supposed to be a good thing, and sometimes I don't sleep that. Sometimes I'm sleeping 6 or 7 hours a night. Oh, and here's a study that says, wow, you're going to die sooner if you sleep 8 hours a night. That's basically, what they're saying here in this research article. So I've got to ask myself, okay, how much am I going to base this as a causal relationship, that it's the sleep that's causing this? I mean, they did study 1.1 million Americans for 6 years. That's got to mean something, right? So let me skim this article and see if there's anything that can help me determine what's happening here. So then I read, the study used data from a massive survey. Okay, boom, boom, boom. There's my first red flag. Survey, they did an observational study. That means that we cannot claim that this is a causal effect. We cannot conclude that the number of hours that you sleep is going to be the cause of how long you live. It could be, but we're not proving that in this type of study. So they did a survey which was conducted by the American Cancer Society between 1982 and 1988. Women sleeping 8, 9, and 10 hours a night had a 13%, 23%, 41% chance, greater risk of dying, respectively, than those who slept 7 hours. Men who slept 8, 9, and 10 hours a night had a 12%, 17%, 34% greater risk of dying, according to the study. So, see, my first thing, though, is it goes back down to the fact that this was an observational study. Now, what if it didn't say that? What if it didn't say there was something about a survey? Well, you look for clues, and anything that suggests that they observe people, which again, remember, 8 or 9 out of 10 studies are probably going to be observational that you read about. So this makes you live in balance. This makes you put this into perspective. The fact that if it sounds like a survey, if it smells like a survey, if it tastes like a survey, if it sounds like they asked people how they did things, most likely they're not manipulating how many hours these people are sleeping and then looking at how long they live. That's not very practical to do. So I find something like this interesting, and I think, wow, this is kind of interesting that sleep and death are related, but I don't assume that sleep and death are causing each other or one's causing the other. I don't go that far, and therefore I'm not going to base my life off of this study. In order for me to base my life off of this study, I would need to see it replicated maybe 100 different times under different circumstances, different people, different areas of the world, different time frames. Otherwise, I'm not believing this. I think that there's other factors going on here. For instance, since it is a survey, we are relying on people's own reports of what their sleeping habits are, which could be faulty. We said this earlier. People may lie about how much they're sleeping. People just may be mistaken about how much they're sleeping. And they may actually say they're sleeping 8 or 9 hours, but they're really sleeping 6 or 7 hours. So how do we know that data is trustworthy and that's actually what people are sleeping? Also, when you ask people how long they slept, they might actually be reporting how long they spent in bed, and that may not be the same number. It may take some people 30 minutes or an hour to fall asleep when they get to bed. They may actually be counting that as part of how much they slept. So this could mean that people who reported sleeping 8 hours were actually sleeping around 7.5 hours, which would bring them into the study's lower risk category. So that is how I would process this particular study, and I wouldn't put a lot of weight on its results. And a lot of studies like that, I wouldn't put a lot of weight on those results as well. It's still a useful information. I don't want to discredit what they did find, but I want to be careful that I don't say that it's the cause of death. It's the cause of lower life expectancy. It could be, and I think it's important enough where I may want to look at my sleep habits and see what's going on. But here's another really important sign that you will find when you look at these studies. Anytime I see studies that contradict each other, I don't really pay a lot of attention on any of those studies. So that's the same thing with the coffee thing. Coffee's good for you, coffee's bad for you. I'm just so tired of all those studies because they're purely observational and they're constantly contradicting whether it's good or bad for you. Same thing with this. There are contradicting studies which say that lots of sleep is good for you, and now this study which says that lots of sleep is bad for you. And I'm thinking, okay, I'm done with this at this point. Until somebody does an experiment on this, it's just useful information, and I've got to determine for myself what is good, what is bad. The second thing you should watch out for is bad samples. So again, how were they taking the sample? So I go back to this article and I think, okay, you said you took a sample, you took these surveys, but how did you do it? Where did these people come from in the first place? It doesn't give me any information about whether these people were randomly selected. Sure, there was 1.1 million of these people, but this was American Cancer Society too that was researching this. So I have to think, okay, are these their records that they have of people? Because if that's the case, that may help explain what's going on here. What's going on here? Where are these people coming from? Bad samples remain bad samples, and really cool statistical techniques can't make up for a really bad sample. We also talked about the response bias. Also, another thing to watch out for is that many studies nowadays are done on college students. And some people have been catching on to this fact that college students are not always representative of the population at large. So you look at something like sleep habits. Well, the sleep habit of a college student, I wouldn't say is the same as a normal person in the workplace. So why would I base my life off of a study done on college students, their self-worth, their purpose in life? Well, a lot of them don't know what their purpose is. They're trying to figure that out. They're in college seeking what their passion, where their productivity is, and they don't always have the best habits all the time. And therefore, I'm going to base my life off of these. So you should also be very careful if any study is done on college students to assume that that generalizes over to your life. Number 3, realize that most studies are actually about averages. And that means they may not be how you experience something. Even if 80% of people do something or it works for them, that doesn't necessarily mean it will work for you. There is no cookie cutter in this. Your life is an adventure, not a formula, and especially not an average. So even if what they say is true, most of the time those results are the average of the outcome, and it doesn't mean that that's the same for you. You have to decide your part in the journey. You have to decide your part in the adventure. And if something resonates with you and it seems to contradict some study, well, who cares? Go with your gut. Go with what resonates with you. Go with what makes you happy. Go with what pushes you towards your potential, towards your passion, towards your dreams. That is what really matters in the end. So when it comes to that study I was talking about earlier with getting up early and being more productive, that didn't resonate with me, to be honest with you. Yeah, there are some people that's worked, and I'm really glad for that. I'm happy for them. I'm happy that they found more productivity by getting up early in the morning. And there may be someday I try that again. Right now, that has never really worked for me. The only thing that works for me is that I find that if I get up early and exercise, I will usually stick with exercise. But otherwise, I don't think very clearly in the morning. And it's not because of some label that I put on myself. And some people can do that. Some people can put a label on themselves and they create a self-fulfilling prophecy. In my case, I've looked and said, I don't put that label on myself. And I just don't always think clearly for some reason in the morning. That's why I like exercise, I think, because I don't think about it. I just do it. But I realize in that particular study, I don't agree with what's gone on in the study. I don't agree that it is a cause and effect relationship. But even if it was, I don't think that works for me. I may be an outlier, or I may be an exception to it, or it may just be that there's a lot more people like that. And again, you can let these type of statistical studies become a should or ought. I've mentioned that several times in these episodes, how you need to avoid shoulding on yourself or ought on yourself, or you should be this. There's no happiness or productivity in that type of living. And many of these studies can make that, well, you should be a morning person. Well, you should get so much sleep. Live your life with passion and intention. Find what resonates with you. Let your own life be an experiment. And use these studies as maybe catalysts. Use them as springboards for ideas, but you make your own life an experiment and you decide what works for you and go for it. And that is my last point, number 4. Let your life be an experiment. Statistics is a start. It can be a direction, but it is never a conclusion. Let me say that again. Statistical studies can be a direction, but never a conclusion. As I said earlier, let your life be an experiment. Find what works for you. Let these studies serve as creative ideas for maybe potential solutions for you, but ultimately what works for you is what works for you, regardless of what any kind of statistical study says. And this comes from a statistician. I'm trained in statistics. I do statistics for a living, and I'm telling you, as a statistician, you go after your dreams and your passions, and you will win every single time. Well, that wraps up this episode on statistics and how it can rob your productivity. I hope you found this helpful. I hope that you will be on the lookout for these types of studies that can rob you and make you believe things are true that really are not true, and apply some of the suggestions that I make. And remember, if you can't figure out what is what, you're better off just assuming that this was probably an observational study to begin with. You can't go wrong that way. And as an observational study, it can provide you interesting aspects to think about, but then it ultimately comes back to what works for you. If you find an experimental study, well, then you may want to apply a little bit more weight for that. But I'll be honest with you, I hardly ever find experimental studies being done today, which again is a very sad thing. But anyway, I hope this helps a little bit. I hope you can find some insights to apply to your life to be more productive and to not let statistical studies rob your productivity most of all. As always, please consider leaving me a rating, comment on iTunes or any other place that you listen to me on. I would greatly appreciate that. Remember my comments earlier, feel free to leave me feedback on my website. I do have a website exclusively for this particular episode at firstthingsproductivity.com/13. On my website, I also have a link to voicemail. And if you have questions for me, if you have particular aspects of the show you would want insights on, feel free to leave me a voicemail. I'll include you on this particular page. If you have a website, feel free to let me know. I will provide that as well when I play your comment on the show. So until next time, remember this. Just because it is statistical doesn't mean you should embrace your life around it. Understand the difference between observational studies and experiments. Be extremely careful in basing anything in your life around an observational studies. Remember that there is response bias. If people are doing surveys, they can sometimes forget things, they can sometimes misinterpret things, and then sometimes people just intentionally lie about things. It's just the nature of surveys. And that's great, but keep your mind intact and know what works for you. Embrace today with passion and intention, and remember, as always, don't die with your music still inside you.